I signed one piece of paper and lost everything I had built in 40 years, and the person who handed me that paper was my own son. My name is Gloria. I am 64 years old and I want to tell you a story about the house I lived in for 38 years, the son I raised in it, the woman he married, and the day I received a legal eviction notice in my own mailbox with my own name on it. I also want to tell you about what came after, because that part of the story is the one that still makes me catch my breath, but in the good way, the kind of way you don't expect at 64 when you think the chapters of your life are mostly written. Let me tell you about the house first. My husband Frank and I bought it in 1986, the year before our son Derek was born. It was a small house on a corner lot on Birchwood Lane and it needed everything, new roof, new kitchen, new everything, and we did most of the work ourselves on weekends over the first 5 years because we couldn't afford to hire anyone and we were young and stubborn and in love with the idea of making something ours. Frank built the back porch with his own hands. I planted the garden along the south fence that first spring and kept adding to it every year until it was something people slowed their cars down to look at in June. Roses mostly, and dahlias, and whatever else caught my eye at the nursery. The garden was mine in a way that's hard to explain, not just property, but something I had grown and tended and loved for decades. Frank died in 2014. Heart attack, very sudden, the kind that doesn't give you time to say what you need to say. Derek was 27 and already with his girlfriend Renata by then, and he was good to me in those first months, present, attentive, the son I had raised him to be. I was grateful for that. I held on to it for a long time as evidence that I knew who my son was. Renata and Derek married in 2016. She was polite at the wedding and polite at the dinners after and polite in the particular way that tells you politeness is a performance and not a disposition. I noticed but I told myself I was being unfair, that she was nervous, that she was still finding her way into the family. I gave her every benefit of every doubt I had because she was Derek's choice and Derek was my son and that was the end of my reasoning. They had 2 children. Marcus is 16 now and his sister Jade is 14. And those 2 children are the best people I know and I mean that without any exaggeration whatsoever. Marcus has his grandfather Frank's eyes and Jade has his laugh and spending time with them was, for many years, the center of everything good in my life. For the first few years after the wedding, things were manageable. Derek and Renata had their apartment across town and I had my house and we saw each other on Sundays and holidays and the garden kept growing and life had its rhythm. And then in 2019 Derek called me and said he had an opportunity, a business he wanted to start with a friend, something in logistics, and the bank required collateral, and he wondered if I would be willing to put the house up as security for the loan. I said I needed to think about it. He called again 3 days later. He said the opportunity was time sensitive. He said it was completely standard, that the house would remain mine in every practical sense, that this was just a formality the bank required to process the paperwork. He said, "Mom, I need you to trust me," and I heard my son's voice saying those words and I signed the papers. I want to be honest about something. I am not a naive woman. I worked as an office manager for 22 years and I understood contracts and I understood that what I was signing had real implications. But there is a particular vulnerability that comes with being a widow who loves her son, and Renata and Derek understood that vulnerability very precisely and they used it very deliberately, and I did not see it until it was too late to matter. The business, I was told, did well for a while. Derek seemed busy and purposeful and when I asked questions he gave me answers that sounded complete without actually containing much information, which I also noticed and also chose not to press. Renata had become, by this point, increasingly present in conversations about finances and decisions and plans, and Derek had become increasingly quiet in those same conversations, and I told myself this was just how marriages worked sometimes, that couples found their dynamic, that it wasn't my business. My neighbor during all of this was a man named Raymond. He had lived next door for 11 years and we had developed, over those years, one of those friendships that grows so gradually you don't notice how deep it's gotten until you're already in it. Raymond had been a police officer for 30 years and had retired at 58 and he had, to my constant delight, an absolute passion for gardening that matched mine entirely. We talked over the fence constantly. He knew every plant in my garden by name and I knew every plant in his, and on the Saturday mornings when we were both out there in the early light before the neighborhood woke up, those were some of the most peaceful hours of my life. He had been a widower for 6 years. He was kind and steady and laughed easily, and I was, if I am honest with myself now, aware that his feelings for me were something more than neighborly, and I had chosen for a long time not to think about that too directly. I received the letter on a Tuesday morning in March. It was official correspondence from a law firm I had never heard of, and it informed me that as the primary mortgage holder on the property at my address, following a default on the associated business loan, foreclosure proceedings had been initiated and I had 60 days to vacate the premises. I stood in my hallway in my bathrobe holding that letter, and I read it 3 times because the first 2 times my brain simply refused to process what it said. And then I sat down on the floor right there in the hallway, not on a chair, on the floor, because my legs stopped working, and I held that piece of paper and I thought about Frank building the back porch, and the garden along the south fence, and 38 years of a life inside those walls, and I felt something that was beyond sadness and beyond anger and was really just a complete and total silence where everything used to be. Then I picked up the phone and called Derek. Derek answered on the 4th ring. I could hear noise in the background, voices, a television, the ordinary sounds of a household going about its Tuesday, and when he said hello his voice had that particular quality of someone who has been waiting for a call and has been dreading it at the same time. I said, Derek, I have a letter from a law firm. I need you to explain this to me. There was a pause. Not a confused pause. Not the pause of someone who doesn't know what you're talking about. A prepared pause. The kind that comes before a speech that has been practiced. He said the business had run into difficulties. He said the loan had gone into default. He said the bank had exercised its right to the collateral. He said it in complete sentences with all the right words and almost no emotion, and I sat on my hallway floor and listened to my son explain to me in careful legal language why I was losing my home, and something very cold settled in the center of my chest. Derek, I said, when he stopped talking. Did you know this was coming? Another pause. There were signs, he said. For a while. How long? I asked. He didn't answer that directly. He said, Renata and I have been talking and we think the best thing would be for you to stay with Aunt Carol for a while until we sort things out. I noticed that he said we think. I noticed that Renata's name came before the plan. I noticed all of it and I said very quietly, is this your decision or hers, Derek? And he said, Mom, it's not like that. And I said, then tell me what it's like, and he didn't have an answer for that either. I asked to speak to the children. Renata came on the line instead. Her voice was composed and businesslike in a way that told me she had also been preparing for this conversation, possibly longer than I had been having it. She said she understood this was difficult. She said these things happened in business. She said she hoped I wouldn't make this harder than it needed to be, and something in the particular way she said that last sentence, the implication that any difficulty was going to come from me and not from the situation she and Derek had created, made me feel something sharpen inside me that I hadn't felt in a long time. I said, Renata, I would like to speak to Marcus and Jade. She said they were busy with homework. I said, they are my grandchildren and I would like to speak to them. There was a long pause and then I heard Renata say something away from the phone and then Marcus's voice came on, 16 years old and careful in a way that told me he had been listening to everything. Grandma, he said. Are you okay? I told him I was fine. I told him not to worry. I told him I loved him and to tell his sister I loved her too, and he said, Grandma, I know what's happening. Jade and I both know. We're really sorry. His voice was steady but young and it broke something in me that had been holding together until that moment, and I said, don't be sorry, sweetheart. None of this is yours to be sorry for. We hung up. I sat on the floor for another few minutes. And then I got up because I am 64 years old and I did not survive losing Frank and building a life alone and 38 years in that house to fall apart on a Tuesday morning on my hallway floor. I went outside into the garden. Raymond was already there on his side of the fence, which was where he usually was on Tuesday mornings, tending to the roses he had planted along his fence line 3 years ago after I had given him a cutting from mine. He looked at my face and he said nothing for a moment and then he said, Gloria, come over here. I went through the gate between our yards and I sat in the chair he kept by his back porch and I told him everything. He listened the way he always listened, completely, without interrupting, with the particular stillness of a man who spent 30 years learning how to hear things that were hard to say. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time and then he said, "What do you need right now?" I said, "I honestly don't know." He said, "Okay. We'll figure it out." The 60 days were both very long and very short. I consulted a lawyer. Raymond came with me to the appointment and sat in the waiting room the entire time, and the legal situation was exactly as bad as the letter had suggested. The papers I had signed in 2019 had been thorough and Renata had, it turned out, been involved in structuring that loan in ways I had not known about at the time. My lawyer was honest with me. She said fighting it would be expensive and the outcome was uncertain. I made the decision not to fight, partly because I didn't have the resources and partly because I looked at the situation clearly and understood that the house at that point was already gone in every way that mattered. Derek called twice during those 60 days. Both times the conversations were short and managed, and I could hear in his voice the particular flatness of a man who has made a choice he knows was wrong and has decided the only way forward is to not examine it too closely. I loved my son. I want to say that clearly because this story could make it sound like I stopped loving him and I didn't. But I understood, in those 60 days, that the person I had believed my son to be and the person he had allowed himself to become were not the same, and that was a grief I had to make room for alongside everything else. Marcus and Jade came to see me on a Saturday 3 weeks before I had to leave. They came alone, on their bicycles, without telling their mother, and Jade knocked on my door with a box of chocolates she had bought with her own pocket money, and Marcus carried in 2 empty boxes and said, "We want to help you pack, Grandma." I stood in my doorway and looked at these 2 children who had their grandfather's eyes and their grandfather's laugh, and I thought about Frank building the back porch, and I thought about the garden, and I let myself cry, properly, for the first time since the letter had arrived. And Jade put her arms around me without saying anything, and Marcus stood very straight in the way 16-year-old boys stand when they are trying to be strong for someone, and that was enough. That was more than enough. We packed for 4 hours. They wrapped my china and carried boxes, and Marcus carefully dug up 3 of my rose plants to take with me and wrapped the roots in wet newspaper the way I taught him to do it years ago. And Jade labeled every box in her careful handwriting and made us all tea at 2 o'clock, and we sat in the half-empty kitchen and drank it, and nobody said very much, and it was the most love I had felt inside those walls in a long time. Raymond had asked me, about 2 weeks into the 60 days, if I would like to come and stay with him while I figured out next steps. He said it matter-of-factly and without pressure, the way he said most things, and he said, "I have the spare room and I have the garden, and I think you should have somewhere to put those rose plants." And then he said, more quietly, "Gloria, I have been your neighbor for 11 years and I think you know that I would very much like to be more than that, if you're ever ready for that. And if you're not, the room is still yours for as long as you need it." I looked at him for a long moment. I thought about 11 years of mornings over the fence and the way he knew every plant in my garden and the way he had sat in that waiting room for 2 hours without being asked. I said, "Raymond, I think I would like both of those things." He smiled. It was the kind of smile that had clearly been waiting a long time to happen. I moved into Raymond's house on a Friday in May with 4 boxes, 3 rose plants in wet newspaper, and Marcus and Jade, who insisted on carrying everything in themselves and then stayed for dinner and ate Raymond's cooking and declared it acceptable, which from 16 and 14-year-olds is practically a standing ovation. The flower shop opened 8 months later. Raymond had the idea first. He said he had been thinking about it for years, that the corner property 2 streets over had been empty for months, that between his savings and mine we could make it work. We called it Birchwood Blooms, after the street where my garden used to grow, and on the opening day Marcus and Jade were there with handmade signs and enormous proud faces, and Derek came too, alone, without Renata, and he stood in the doorway of the shop for a long moment looking at everything, and then he looked at me and said, "Mom, I'm sorry. I'm really sorry." And I said, "I know, Derek." And I meant it. And I let him hug me because he was still my son, even if he was also someone I was still learning to see clearly. Raymond was standing behind the counter when that happened, arranging dahlias, pretending very convincingly not to be listening, and when Derek left he looked at me and said, "You okay?" I looked around at the shop, the flowers everywhere, the light coming through the front window, Marcus and Jade still outside with their signs. This whole new thing that had grown out of the worst Tuesday morning of my life. "More than okay," I said. He reached across the counter and took my hand and didn't say anything else, and neither did I. And that was enough. That was more than enough.